Let's start with an idea that's, well, it's so audacious it probably makes geopolitical experts clutch their pearls. Is present-day Europe since 1945 actually in a colonial situation rather than a true equal partnership with the United States?
Yeah.
It's a really provocative premise, I know, but the sources we're diving into today argue that the evidence is just overwhelming, and that the only way forward for Europe is full-scale decolonization, both intellectually and politically.
It is a massive claim, but the sources, they really provide a detailed roadmap for it. We're exploring texts focus on decolonizing Europe, and specifically what the French historian Ludovic Tournez calls the urgent need to break the Atlanticist taboo.
Okay, let's unpack that right away. What exactly is the Atlanticist taboo?
It's a core concept in these sources. The Atlanticist taboo is this unwritten rule that has governed European political thought since 1945.
The basic assumption.
Exactly. The fundamental assumption that American leadership is necessary, that it's inevitable and, ultimately benign for Europe's security and prosperity.
So breaking this taboo means questioning that sacred cow.
It means challenging the idea that Europe must always align its foreign policy, its military, even its cultural stories with Washington.
That sets up our mission perfectly then. We need to understand the arguments for why Europe must reclaim its defense, its economy, and maybe most importantly, its collective mindset.
Yeah.
Because since World War II, the continent has maintained what the sources bluntly call a subordinate relationship with the U.S., one that was cemented during the Cold War and then really intensified after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Absolutely. Tournez is very, very clear on this. He states that Europe must decolonize both European defense and mindsets to oppose what's now being called the recolonization promised by the White House.
And what makes this so immediate, not just some historical theory, is the recent context. The sources cite statements made since January 2025 by Donald Trump as the latest catalyst.
That's the trigger. This is presented as protection blackmail. The U.S. is signaling very clearly that if Europe wants the protection of the American umbrella, it has to guarantee its own defense.
But on their terms.
Exactly. By being compelled to purchase U.S. weapons, U.S. oil, and U.S. gas. It's a difficult moment, but also, a necessary moment of forced emancipation. The old deal is just being revoked.
Okay, let's unpack this dependence. If Europe needs to break free, what's the core obstacle holding it back? Because we can build tanks and missiles, but the sources argue that's not nearly enough.
That's right. The issue is dependency, but the solution, it needs two components to achieve true existence: weapons and a narrative. The sources quote Tournez directly on this. Europe needs weapons to defend itself, but it needs a narrative to exist. If Europe just focuses on being a military bloc without defining why it exists or what it represents, well, it's just going to stay vulnerable.
I find it fascinating how quickly the sources pivot from, defense budgets to high-level culture. They bring up that powerful quote attributed to Jean Monnet, one of the EU's founding fathers.
If I had to start over, I would begin with culture.
Yes.
That quote is the foundation of their whole argument. Culture, they argue, has to be seen as the absolute bedrock of Europe. Not some afterthought, and definitely not the first thing you slash from the budget.
And their definition of culture isn't just books or art.
No, not at all. It's the accumulated narration, the images, symbols, the shared objects of a collective adventure that constitutes a feeling of belonging.
So culture is basically the shared memory and the common vision that makes millions of people across dozens of countries feel like they belong to a single project.
Precisely. Without that, that unified, emotionally resonant sense of shared purpose, Europe, well, it just remains a technocratic structure, no matter how integrated its economy is.
What does that actually look like, a technocratic structure?
It's a political entity driven by rules and metrics and market directives, not by shared moral or cultural goals. Think of it this way. When a crisis hits, say, a pandemic or a war on its border, its reaction is dictated by bureaucracy.
And internal compromises.
Right. Not a quick, unified response based on a common emotional understanding of destiny. It lacks the soul it needs for true political independence.
And what's paralyzing the development of that soul? The sources call it a shock of dispossession.
Since 1945, Europe has basically been deprived of the right to write its own story. The narrative was written for it by the U.S. after the war.
The story being?
That Europe's own internal demons, fascism, totalitarianism, colonialism, led it to ruin, and the U.S. had to step in as the benevolent big brother, the guide to reconstruction and modernization.
So that U.S. written narrative essentially locks Europe into a subsidiary role in its own history. It constantly needs external validation, which is why the sources say Europe must dismantle three crucial myths.
Yes, this is about provincializing the U.S., treating it as one great power among others, not the inevitable global guide.
Let's get into them. Myth number 1.
The United States is an inherent perpetual ally or friend.
This assumes a fixed partnership. But history, the sources argue, shows something very different, that the U.S. rarely enters binding alliances that don't primarily serve its own self-interest.
Absolutely. And you can look back at the country's founding principles. They cite Thomas Jefferson's 1801 inaugural address, where he emphasized maintaining peace, commerce, and loyal friendship with all nations. No binding alliance with any.
No binding alliance with any. That's a core principle.
It's a historical bedrock of American foreign policy.
So for you listening, you might ask, isn't NATO the ultimate proof of an alliance?
And that's a great question because the sources argue NATO is actually the mechanism of subordination. Since 1945, they say the relationship has been, at best, a tactical partnership that can be pressed or dictated to, and at worst, a protectorate that has to buy American products. It turns Europe into, fundamentally, a market for American products.
Okay, moving on to myth number 2. This one is maybe harder for many Europeans to shake. The United States is the pinnacle of modernity.
This one is so pervasive because it was aggressively exported after World War II, especially through Marshall Plan rhetoric. Europe adopted American modernity, the Fordist production system, mass consumption.
And that model was successful in the short term. It fueled the post-war boom. But why is it no longer the ideal?
Because when you look closer, contemporary American modernity is structurally inefficient and, well, it's increasingly dysfunctional. While Europe initially adopted the Fordist model, countries like Germany and Japan adapted it, making their car industries far more competitive and fuel efficient by the 60s and 70s. The U.S. model today consumes vast resources, hundreds of billions on defense, abysmal energy consumption, and yet it produces less efficiently than other models.
We're talking about systemic failure here, aren't we?
Precisely. The sources point to massive structural inefficiencies. The bloated private healthcare system, crumbling infrastructure. They even compare it to the emerging 2025 model being developed by China, which can pivot huge resources so much faster.
So the argument is simple.
Yep.
The U.S. system doesn't produce better. It just expends more energy and money for fewer stable benefits for its citizens. Which brings us to myth number 3. And this one hits right at the heart of the moral legitimacy the U.S. gained after the war. The United States is supposedly a model of democracy.
The U.S. certainly acquired massive moral prestige after 1945. It was seen as the beacon against fascism and Soviet communism, the standard bearer for the rule of law.
But the sources argue that prestige has eroded. Is that maybe too harsh, though? I mean, you still got institutions like the Supreme Court, strong universities.
The sources focus not on individual institutions, but on the fragility of the political system itself. They argue it's become fundamentally dysfunctional.
And their evidence.
The repeated disputing of election results, they cite the 2000 election and, of course, 2016, plus numerous violations of the rule of law tied to executive power.
And the ultimate evidence of this institutional failure cited is the attempted coup on January 6, 2021.
Correct. The sources present that day not as some isolated incident, but as the culmination of decades of a system that prioritizes political warfare over stability. Their conclusion is stark.
In terms of democracy, the United States no longer has any lessons to teach anyone.
That is the necessary psychological precondition, then. If Europe stays traumatized by its past and looks to Washington for moral guidance, it can never think for itself. Exactly. Provincializing the U.S., showing it's not a perpetual ally, not the most efficient model, and not a functional democracy, that's the required first step.
So if Europe is finally breaking free from this imposed history, what does its future narrative look like? Especially when you're facing Putin on one side and a potential Trump administration on the other.
Well, first it has to address the dark thread of its own history, the 2 world wars, centuries of colonialism. Those failures created the power vacuum that let the U.S. and USSR become superpowers. You can't just pretend that didn't happen.
But the sources suggest there's an opportunity in the current crisis.
Right.
The aggressive stance from Washington actually provides the ingredients for a new European story.
It's a definition by opposition. By presenting the U.S. as what the sources call an imperial, aggressive, predatory power, Europe is forced to define itself by what it is not.
So if Washington is the opposite of what Europe should be?
Then Europe can step forward with a coherent identity.
And what is that forward-looking vision? What is Europe meant to become?
The sources argue Europe can set an example of a non-aggressive and non-imperialist power with a universal, even pluriversal message.
Okay, pluriversal message. What does that mean in this context?
It means acknowledging that there are multiple centers of power and modernity in the world, not just a single Western one led by the U.S. Europe's message has to appeal globally, recognizing that diversity. It could lay the foundations for a new, peaceful modernity, a stark contrast to the backward regression they see sinking the United States.
That connects the philosophical need for a narrative right back to concrete economic action. Which brings us to our final segment, culture as industrial policy. This isn't just about feel-good history, it's about money.
Precisely. There is no inevitability preventing Europe from developing world-class cultural industries. We often underestimate the strategic genius of the U.S. I mean, since the 20th century, Hollywood understood its dual objective.
It's not just entertainment.
No, it's entertaining the population and telling a story that rewrote and magnified American power and values globally.
It's soft power, the constant projection of American exceptionalism, the individual hero narrative. Europe hasn't really countered that.
And that's why this needs attention. But the sources give undeniable evidence that American dominance isn't inevitable. They point to contemporary Chinese cinema.
Tell us about that.
They highlight the dramatic success of Chinese cinema in achieving cultural self-sufficiency. They specifically note that in 2025, Ne Zha 2 became the first non-American film to hit #1 at the global box office. And critically, 98% of its revenue was earned outside the U.S. market.
Wow. That proves it's possible.
It proves cultural industrial power is possible without being dependent on Hollywood distribution or U.S. market approval.
That is massive. So what specific actionable policies do the sources recommend for Europe?
They argue culture must be treated as a proactive policy, a central industrial effort. The first recommendation is institutional. Create a fully fledged strategic commissioner for culture.
Elevate it from its current subordinate position.
Right. It's currently buried under a commission confusingly called Intergenerational Equality, Youth Culture, and Sport.
Give it the weight it deserves, like trade or defense.
Exactly. And back it up with serious investment. They need a dedicated culture station to support pan-European production, enhance distribution, and forge partnerships. This means developing world-class industries, film studios, music industries, and critically, European-based streaming platforms.
Because right now, even if you make great content, the audience is still accessed through U.S. channels, which means the U.S. gets the data, the profit, and keeps the power.
That's the crux of the economic problem. This entire overhaul, it requires a profound rethinking of the economic rules upon which the great European market has been built. The current rules of free market competition, they argue, just perpetually favor the existing American giants.
So if they break that Atlanticist taboo and treat culture as an economic and strategic necessity, the sources conclude Europe can come out ahead, both symbolically, by defining its own destiny, and economically, by capturing huge global revenue. Cultural sovereignty is inseparable from political and economic freedom.
And this leads us to the final provocative thought for you to carry forward. The source material argues that Washington is the exact opposite of what Europe should be: imperial, predatory, dysfunctional. If cultural sovereignty really is the prerequisite for political and economic freedom, what's the profound long-term consequence of continually postponing major public investment in a continental narrative? What foundational cultural tools is Europe missing today? What kind of unifying, emotionally resonant European story just cannot be told or distributed because of the continued paralyzing prevalence of the Atlanticist taboo? It's a massive challenge, and one that, well,